Good afternoon. Welcome to the New School. For you who haven't been here, it's a real great pleasure to welcome you officially to this auditorium, the historic Tishman Auditorium in the New School. My name is Karen Cooney. I have had the good fortune of running the Vera List Center for 8 years. I started in 2004. And today, of course, as you probably know, we're here to celebrate the anniversary of an institution that I feel has really left significant traces and contributed in significant ways to an understanding of where art and politics meet and of the space that art contributes to creating, a civic space for all of us to inhabit in public forums such as this or out in the world. And in just a brief reference to the public forum, what you might be wearing now is a name tag that was created by Paul Ramirez Jonas, an artist we commissioned to work with us and have an intervention with the archive. And he, a bit like me, went through boxes and decided that was simply too much to digest in an elaborate way, and decided that he wanted to allow the audience members and the speakers to all meet on the same terms, us claiming identities or being identities and reenacting certain personas from the present or the past, and the panelists at the public events would do so as well. I went through the boxes a little longer and felt that there were four different topics emerging over the course of 20 years of programming. One important one was art and activism and the role of media propaganda in an artist's work. The other topic that came up again and again was identity politics, and we had those two topics in some ways covered this morning in a panel. Another one that we're going to address now is the relationship between aesthetics and politics, or the aesthetics of politics. And I'm thrilled to have an extremely distinguished panel of speakers help us illuminate that area. At 4:15, we will present what we've been labeled the People's Panel. In an attempt to revisit our history, we thought we shouldn't just do that ourselves, but throw it up to whoever was interested. We listed and have extensive documentation of all events that were ever presented at the Vera List Center. This archive is online, and asked people to select the event they'd like to revisit and rethink and re-engage with again. So the fourth panel is this People's Choice, which we're going to present at 4:15. But now, call and response number 3, political aesthetics. And I will really just briefly read the abbreviated versions of the biographies of our speakers, and then have David Joselit, who is the moderator, and on the very right, moderate the discussion. So why don't we start with him? David is an art historian and editor of the journal October, who writes regularly on contemporary art and culture. He worked as a curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston from 1983 to 89, where he co-organized several exhibitions, including Descent, the issue of modern art in Boston, Endgame, reference and simulation, recent painting and sculpture, and the British Edge. After receiving his PhD in art history from Harvard in 1995, he began teaching in the Department of Art History and PhD program in visual studies at the University of California in Irvine, where he taught until 2003. And David is currently the Carnegie Professor of the History of Art at Yale, where he also served as department chair from 2006 to 2009. Joselit is the author of Infinite Regress, Marcel Duchamp, 1910 to 1941, American Art since 1945, Feedback, Television Against Democracy, and then After Art, which is, I think, your most recent book, published in 2012 by Princeton University Press. On David's right is Martha Rosler, and I immediately want to announce that she is an esteemed member of the advisory committee of the Vera List Center. She is an artist. She works in a variety of media, including photography, video, performance, sculpture, and installation, and has published many essays on art and culture. Some of her best-known works deal with geopolitical dilemmas of dispossession and entitlement, often addressing the public sphere and landscape of everyday life, especially as they affect women. If you lived here, a cycle of exhibitions and forums on housing, homelessness, and the built environment, which were presented at DIA Art Foundation when it was still called that, and when it was still in Soho in 1998, is considered a groundbreaking exhibition paradigm, and I'm sure you've either seen it or if you've read about it. Rosler has been the recipient of many awards, including the Oskar Kokoschka Prize, the Spectrum International Prize in Photography, a Guggenheim Museum Lifetime Achievement Award, and the College Art Association's Distinguished Feminist Award. In 2012, she was awarded a doctorate honoris causa by the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. Next is Joao Ribas, who is curator at the MIT List Visual Arts Center in Cambridge. He was previously a curator at the Drawing Center in New York. He is the winner of 4 consecutive ICA exhibition awards over the last 4 years, and of an Emily Hall Tremaine Exhibition Award, which was presented to him in 2010. His recent curated exhibitions include the In the Holocene, Stan van der Beek, The Culture Intercom, Manon de Boer, and Francis Stark, so a lot of one-person exhibitions, and then Ree Morton at the Still Point of the Turning World, which was presented at the Drawing Center in 2009. He's a frequent contributor to numerous publications, catalogs, and monographs. He was previously adjunct faculty at the School of Visual Arts in New York and at RISD, and he's also a co-curator of the print portfolio that is available and presented outside the auditorium and was published by MIT, Lincoln Center, and the Vera List Center in celebration of the philanthropic legacy and impact of Vera List, whose generosity created 6 List art institutions at 5 universities and Lincoln Center. Then Julie Mehretu is an artist whose exhibition at Marian Goodman Gallery just opened a few days ago. Her paintings and drawings refer to elements of mapping and architecture, achieving a calligraphic complexity that resembles turbulent atmospheres and dense social networks. Architectural renderings and aerial views of urban grids enter the work as fragments, losing their reality and specificity related to reality or the world, and challenging thereby narrow geographic and cultural readings. Among the many awards that Mehretu has garnered is the Berlin Prize in 2007, the American Academy in Berlin honor, a MacArthur Foundation Award in 2005, the American Art Award, which is offered by the Whitney Museum, that was also presented to you in 2005. Mehretu studied at University Sheikh Anta Diop in Dakar and earned a BA from Kalamazoo College in Michigan and an MFA from RISD in Providence. And then Simon Critchley, who is a professor here at the New School, the Hans Jonas Professor of Philosophy at the New School for Social Research. He also runs the New York Times philosophy series, The Stone. He's a prolific author. His most recent book is The Faith of the Faithless in 2012. And his next book is entitled Stay Illusion, The Hamlet Doctrine. And it's coming out this year from Pantheon Press. So thank you for being here, and thank you too.
So, can you hear me? Is this on? No. Okay. Oh, is this better now? Okay. As with the other panels, I was asked to give all of the panelists in advance a question, which I'll read for you in a moment, and have them respond a little bit to that first. And we're going to do it in alphabetical order, so Simon and on down. I just want to say one thing. To preface my question, this panel is called The Political Aesthetic, and I think that there has been a kind of inflation of the term political in the analysis of works of art in recent decades, I would say, not even recent years. And so my goal or hope for our panel is that we'll really think about what we mean by saying that something's political in our context of art at this moment. Of course, there are many contexts in which any person who might be a worker in the art world can operate in, but I think our focus today will be how the production of art, how aesthetics in some way can participate in a political project. So in order to elicit as specific a response to this problem or question or even crisis, one could say, I tried to make a question that was very, very clear and literal. So I hope that in fact it is. And the question is the following. In order for art to be political, must it intervene in a worldly debate or conflict? Or, as certain modernists believed, are there aesthetic acts that in themselves may be considered political? So we're starting a bit with a dichotomy, which is somewhat artificial, I suppose. But the real question is, how must a work of art engage with the world in order to pass this threshold of some kind of political action? So with that preface, I think we'll start with our initial comments and start with Simon.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Karen. Thank you, David. In order for art to be political, must it intervene in a worldly debate or conflict? My answer is no. Or, as certain modernists believed, are there aesthetic acts that in themselves may be considered political? I guess my answer is going to be yes. That's about it. But I've got some more to say. That's a start. And so hopefully that's cleared that one up. I'll skip that. Fireflies. Fireflies began to disappear from the cities of Europe and the West in the 1950s, along with the evaporation of collective ideologies of social transformation. Fireflies disappeared along with the rise of pollution and the collapse of the political and aesthetic imagination. Fireflies are tiny material markers of resistance, the suicide bombers of the insect world. The question of experimentation in art and politics, I think, turns on the survival of fireflies. The philosopher Jean-François Lyotard curated a famous exhibition at the Centre Pompidou in 1985, which was called Les Immatériaux. Fewer people know that he was planning a second show called Résistance, Resistance, which was never realized because of his untimely death. If Lyotard's show were ever to be brought into being as a kind of posthumous exhibition, having a life after death or an endless life, and someone should do it, then it would have to involve a lot of fireflies. It would be a show about something which is disappearing, or which no longer exists, or which never existed, or which flares up at the frontiers of existence before being extinguished in inexistence. Art, politics, and perhaps life itself, in my humble opinion, should be orientated towards that which does not exist. The possibility of fireflies. We might call this the infinite demand of art. The infinite demand of art. What is infinitely demanding is the cultivation of an ethical disposition of commitment towards a possibility as yet unknown or inexistent in the situation. So an infinite demand as an orientation towards a possibility as yet unknown and inexistent in the situation, but still powerfully imagined. An event, a utopian moment, a firefly, what I call, borrowing from Wallace Stevens, a supreme fiction. That is a fiction we know to be a fiction, there being nothing else, but a fiction in which we believe, which we hold to be true, the fiction of an absolute. Strictly and even logically speaking, this demand is nothing. It's nothing in the situation. It's nothing that exists. This is like the logic of what Georges Bataille calls sovereignty, and a key term in his work. And when, in his very late work, he describes sovereignty, which is what he's after, he describes it with the formula, impossible, yet there it is. Impossible, yet there it is. It's something irreducible to any principle of utility, something radiantly useless. This idea of the impossible, yet there it is a little like our relation to death, inconceivable in the minds of the living, and yet absolutely certain. We will pass from existence to inexistence like fireflies. The infinite demand is a double demand. To see what is in terms of what is not yet, and to see what is not yet in what is. To see what is in terms of what is not yet, and to see what is not yet in what is. This is the implication, I think, I guess what I'm defending. It's a response to the question. It's what I see as a utopian standpoint. The standpoint of inexistence, where one sees all things as if they were not, and one sees what is not yet in what is. We need more fireflies, tiny markers of resistance, evanescent light traces of what is not in what is. Art, I think, is a privileged zone for the production of fireflies. Art is, beware of propositions that begin in that form. Art is not a series of facts to be noted, where each artist is like an amoeba producing work we can discuss, exchange. Wow. Discuss, exchange, and to which we can accord symbolic and financial value. Art is not, as Liam Gillick puts it, just a universe of artistic amoebae. It's a chain. It's also a chain. In my view, art is not a fact or a series of facts that took place in the past. Right? Art is an event that provokes the production of other events, a form that is capable of producing future forms. Right? So an event that has the possibility of other events, a form that's capable of producing future forms, inducing at its best new behaviors among its spectators. So art, it's a first approximation, is not a record of a state of things. It's a matrix or a score that generates other objects, events, spaces, and attitudes. And that's what I think of as art, as a kind of matrix of an infinite demand. So it's the idea of art not as something that took place, but art as a chain which allows for the production of future forms. And I think that, for me, is the question. And those future forms would be those little fireflies.
Extremely beautiful. I would also agree, instead of answering the two-parted question with no and yes, I would want to say both might be possible right in the center of the two. Kind of no, I would agree to the first part of the question, and yes to the second, but with some regard to that being a possibility in the middle of the two. This is almost a place that I find myself in my practice and my work. I paint, and I'm a painter, and I make drawings, and for the past 20 years I spend my days going into the studio and working. And the way that I begin work after reading the newspaper or listening to the news and listening to a lot of news, I start drawing, and it's usually with graphite or a pen, and I sit down and draw, usually either on a piece of paper or on a large painting that I'm working on, or a small painting, whatever it might be. But it's a very isolated practice, very isolated experience, and it's taken me a long time to really understand how I participate and digest this information that the world around me, and as a practice, it's really helped me also understand who I am in my participation with the world. And so I'll insist on and continue to work with this understanding that the mark, drawing on a piece of paper, a clean piece, whatever it might be, taking up a pencil or a pen and making this mark is a defiant gesture, is a gesture of potent action. So just to find the note that I want to read, it's right here. Wow, now it's like pretending not to be there. So I hope it opens, but it was actually open, and then I opened the question. But so if the mark I had some quick notes to write about this, but if the mark has this ability and can behave this way and participates, if you will, like the firefly, with this motivation of its insistence, but also and in that way an action of dissent in the context of the archive of a historic, political, and architectural social past that's collapsed and woven together into some kind of rhizome network entanglement, then this mark in its effort can actually what can come from that. And I've gone through many stages in my making where the forms of architectural information that come into the work are very much informed by how I'm digesting a political and social reality around me. And then the marks find this way of somehow, with the image that they are able to create with their interaction or digestion or annihilation of this place, or even in some senses this fusing together of a new type of form, new type of place within the pressurized state of the material. There's a new form that emerges, and in that new form there's a type of experience that is what I'm most interested in. This type of experience is a physical, retinal, visual, emotional, psychic experience that happens because of one's interaction and knowledge of the context, urban context that we participate in. And so I'm sorry, but my notes were here and they didn't load. That is a little poem that I wrote that I wanted to read. But one thing that I will say that I was able to jot down, and it's interesting coming right after you. It's a quote, a Sun Ra quote, and I said the same quote at the symposium in Harvard. But it really kind of articulates in a way what I'm thinking, the way that I approach working, where the impossible attracts me because everything possible has been done and the world didn't change. And so this type of possibility in painting for something else to occur, where there's this, and it's within me also as a social agent, working in this very isolated, independent, very strict medium, to invest in something else that might be possible. That's maybe a way to address this question.
Well, I first off want to thank Karen and Chelsea for their gracious invitation, and I promise to, as assiduously as I can, keep to our 5-minute requirement. I think the very question framing the discussion invokes a kind of inherited antagonism, the supposedly inimical relationship between politics and aesthetics that define the critical debates around modern and post-war culture. As twin polarities, social or political progress on the one hand, and autonomous or formal criteria on the other, underscored both the cultural politics of the avant-gardes and the reactionary conservatism of trenchant forms of formalism, as well as the inverse function of art as historically utilitarian. The narrative of such oppositional distinctions between autonomy and activism runs through the cultural programs of the last century. The formalism of Frey, Bell, Shklovsky, and Greenberg, the realistic in form and socialist in content directive of Soviet art, the sublation of art into life by the historical avant-gardes, the anti-aesthetic character of postmodernism, and even the debates on the political efficacy of social practice today. With the popular uprisings of the Arab Spring, the entangled debts and occupations of global capital, and the new aesthetic of affects produced by the hypno-nomada, or the externalized memory of the digital, it is apt to ask whether these supposed oppositions and antinomies remain central to the relevance of art to contemporary politics. In order to affirm their engagement as both political and aesthetic practices, do contemporary practices need to reformulate relations between autonomy, imagination, responsibility, justice, and agency? Is contemporary art still caught between the option of radicality or instrumentality on the one hand, or its disillusion into relativism, commodification, or spectacle on the other? What such state distinctions obscure is an underlying condition for today's cultural practices, that much of contemporary art affirms that culture is simultaneously both complicit with and a form of resistance to hegemony and capital. This is to recognize the extent to which aesthetic modalities have been subjected to reappropriation or co-optation by contemporary forms of repression. This takes the shape not only of the illegal detention of artists like Pussy Riot or Ai Weiwei, but as the shattered fragments of our own easy iconoclasm, the images we compress to fit into the palms of our hands, or the images that we easily break into shards on YouTube, an iconoclasm engendered by both capital and generosity. As such, this reflects how aesthetic modalities are clearly linked to the affects and socially binding processes of production and consumption, and thus how aesthetic experience is central to the performance-driven, informationally dense, cognitarian conditions of living in the late capitalist cloud. Moreover, we no longer merely look at images. We now pinch, drag, scroll, swipe, and flick them, gestures that have been patented by corporations for almost 2 decades. This somatic codification of labor at the very level of a gesture inscribes an order of relation of us to what we produce. As such, what might be the Chaplin-esque equivalent of these gestures? The movements that easily or not so easily escape or disrupt the model of production they imply. What does it mean to touch an image rather than to merely look at it? And what might we call the haptic equivalent of looking away? Do we need to develop politically or ethically informed rather than legally compelled ways to deal with aesthetic modalities, such as talking about the right to be offended? Perhaps here too we have the question of the valences of or the responsibility to other disciplines. Does art have the right to act irresponsibly, or should it be beholden to ethical, political, or ideational criteria? Or do we need to develop aesthetically defined notions of such criteria, including notions of our engagement beyond simple moral or legal codes, mapped social effects, or political consensus? In the early 2000s, a software program called Bugsplat was developed to calculate the precise effect and number of casualties caused by a bomb. Through the manipulation of different variables, as A.L. Weisman explains, quote, soldiers and planners can play with the angles until they get the number of casualties they need. The calculations involved in this kind of proportionality, governed by establishing a threshold, are guided by a moral economy constituted precisely through such images. The software is called Bugsplat because a kill seen in the green image, a pixelated image in the drone's camera, gives the sense of an insect being crushed. What distinctions can or should we make between what is taking place on the ground and within the realm of cultural production then on today's geopolitical stage? Is it the nature of global capital to regulate, repress, or appropriate both as political commodities? Are there not nations that are noted both for their engagement with contemporary art and for their repressive political regimes? These contradictory states in which contemporary art finds itself can perhaps invite us to reaffirm the paradoxical but productive legacy of the post-war left, the project of uniting politics with the imagination. In this sense, the critical neglect of such oppositional rhetoric might call for a revision of both criteria, with the political character of these practices expanded beyond mildly suissant-retard political inflections. The crowds of Tahrir Square were not the crowds of the Latin Quarter. Along with an elaborated sense of what a committed or engaged social practice might be, grounded, say, in an active politics of citizenship, responsibility, and social justice, a recovery from such neglect entails the ongoing critique of aesthetic affects, such as disgust, cuteness, sharing, liking, and anxiety. Distinctions between critical or non-critical art, or between art or activism, may perhaps be less relevant than the question of what kind of imaginary we can mobilize against the imaginary that operates both in the streets and the Situation Room. An example of such a political project is aptly to be found at the foundation of Western aesthetic theory itself, and this is what I'll end on. It was precisely here, at the New School, that Hannah Arendt enacted such a Talmudic reading of Kant's third critique, transposing aesthetics into a democratic politics. In these late lectures, Arendt recovers a conception of politics not from Kant's published writings on universal history, not from the metaphysics of morals, or from political right, but directly from the discussion of aesthetic judgment, turning the third critique into the great book of political philosophy missing in Kant's critical project. It is the intersubjective character of judging that is reconceived as a political philosophy, quote, a democratic politics of common sense, centered on the importance of judgment to citizenship. The, quote, making present to my mind the standpoints of those who are absent, reveals it to be a crucial political activity, entailing our sharing the world with others. Judgment implies a shared community, itself a necessity for judging, with the act of judging as constituting an act of belonging. This public nature reflects Arendt's concern with the common public world in which politics is actually enacted. The political in this sense is conceived, quote, as a worldly reality, tangible in words which can be heard, in deeds which can be seen, and in events which are talked about. Does the future of art acting politically in such a manner lie then, as Tom Hollert has recently suggested, quote, in the responsibility of the people who produce, perform, curate, disseminate, and display it? Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I thought a lot about these questions when we received them a week or so ago, and I wrote many responses, threw them away, and finally decided that my instinctive reaction was, in a sense, a correct representation of where I stand right now, which is I don't want to be asked these questions, and I don't want to be bothered with them. I mean that with no disrespect. I enjoyed very much these presentations. I would say what Joao said, I thought that was pretty close to my position in a lot of ways, but I also feel like increasingly the part of my brain that sits and writes screeds and analyses does not want to be sitting on a stage. However, thanks, Georgia. One does wish to be civil, and also one understands that this is my community. So I did try to make something of an effort to pick up some fragments from things I've written. I don't know how long it'll be, but I'm going to ask the questions again. That came from David. In order for art to be political, must it intervene in a worldly debate or conflict? The words intervene and worldly are interesting sort of newspeak for various other things. I mean, what's the opposite of worldly? Is it otherworldly? Is it metaphysical? It's hard to know. Does it exclude the aesthetic? And the second question, or the second half, as certain modernists believed, certain unnamed modernists believe, are there aesthetic acts that in themselves may be considered political? It's easy to say that my answer to the first question, must art intervene, is yes and no. And my answer to the second question, as certain modernists believe, are there aesthetic acts that, in other words, the formalist question, and the answer is maybe. So, of course, I'm not being very helpful. I'm going to start with a little quote that seems a bit unfashionable because it uses the incautious language of the, shall we say, utopian 30s, at least in terms of questions of what art and representation could do. It's from John Grierson. The penalty of realism is that it's about reality and has to bother forever, not about being beautiful, but about being right. Well, even Grierson didn't think he could get away with that, but it's worth putting that out there. As Joao suggested, people have questioned art's engagement in the world for over 100 years now, more or less. Before that, it's hard to imagine this question being raised in quite the dichotomous form that it's been raised. My keywords here will be first context, which Julie also mentioned, in that it seems to me that the meaning of a work is in part, if not wholly, dependent on the contextualizing frame, the universe of discourse in which the work is embedded. My second keyword is connectivity, which is a kind of a little buzzword that has to do with who you hanging with and with whom you ally yourself. And it's something more of a social thing than talking about context. And also aspirational in some ways. Speaking personally, I see the question as it was offered as the obverse of the question, but is it art? Which always seems slightly, if not wholly, beside the point, if not offensive. What is also absent, but nevertheless embedded, are the charges of propaganda, ugliness, obviousness, banality, and instrumentalism. And we can add all kinds of unkind words describing primarily people on the political left. Thus, I find myself unwilling to engage in this debate because I'm too old and I've heard it all. That's not what I meant to say. The question presupposes we can find a work of art that is not political. But for the past 40 years, at least, we've challenged that possibility. And I heard a little rumblings of challenge in some of the things people said. But in a word, for aesthetic acts to be political, again, we have to accept that the reading is one of convention and context. Work is read by people according to the texts and understandings in which those works have been presented to them, contexts and understandings. I'll not take the time to distinguish among art worlds, but of course we know there are different circles of production and reception. So when we're looking back at works of other eras about which claims of utopian meaning are ascribed, the Bauhaus being a particularly interesting example because there was a metaphysical current running through it, literally. We have to understand that as it appears to us now, the text has a different context. I certainly appreciate aesthetic well-formedness, but I also acknowledge the degree to which aesthetics both shift, and even more so, I used as a cover what I've called an aesthetic surplus or a necessary surplus by documentarians, including John Grierson, and the way photographers like Stieglitz and Steichen could shift the conversation by increasing the visual palatability and reference to art historical trends in their work. If we want to think about the history of photography, the fin de siècle moment of the previous century is interesting. If you contrast a proto-anthropological photographer like Adam Clark Broman and then mid-century W. Gene Smith, both consciously engaged in the tropes of Western master painting in order to make their photographs comprehensible. We could also mention current documentarians who do the same. And one wonders then what that means in terms of the readability and, if one might say, the evil word use of their work. I happen to find them both extremely interesting, but that's a question. I choose to regard Zola's defense of Manet's Olympia as a formal endeavor, as something of a juridical ploy to rescue the artist from the infamy of thus depicting a comfortable and impertinent demi-mondaine, we all know about this, rescuing the act of painting and separating it from the subject matter, again we know all of this, which scandalizes through matters of sexuality and class. But it's difficult to see that separation as a reasonable one, which is why I called it juridical. I suggest that aestheticism, which is the extreme position, was in part potentiated by, on the one hand, a fin de siècle reaction against commodity pressures, and, as has been noted, and on the other side, a bourgeois reaction to the formation of a class of workers known as proletarians and their solidarity in advanced Western European national economies, the apparent rise of a nascent class for itself, in quotes, with which intellectuals and artists were allied rather than remaining solely within their class boundaries or bohemian disengagement. In other words, this idea of a kind of united front, which has had many meanings, but let's just leave it there. Perhaps I've gotten the temporal order wrong. Perhaps there's more myth than fact in that picture. But when an artist allied with the revolution paints a black square over a whited out landscape, we can say that artist is announcing a new reality under construction and from an aerial perspective. Of course, that was over 100 years ago. In the post-war world, Adorno and others engaged in a rethinking of questions of political commitment with Sartre's What is Literature and perhaps Benjamin's author as producer in the background. And I'm going to skip my quote from Adorno because I feel like I don't have time to actually do it properly, but ultimately Adorno diagnoses Sartre as having slid into German speculative idealism. But what Adorno wished to reserve to the arts is the ability to disrupt art's commodity status and to present a radical break with the ideologies, or if you wish, the realities of modern life. The work of art is given an autonomy that stares into the face of evil and acts as its mirror and its denial simultaneously. But enter the 60s, which is when Adorno actually wrote Commitment, which is, I notice, resurfacing on Facebook. Here comes the paradigm shift, which we all know about, brought about by the predicted life of mass culture and an abrupt about-face on the part of art to confront it rather than ignore it, to confront it directly, coupled with the enormous rise in the market of symbolic goods, also known as art. For the past I'm not going over, am I?
You're fine.
Okay. For the past 4 decades at least, these questions that were posed seem very much beside the point, because what has been called political art at various points has been continually returning via the practices of artists pretty much everywhere. We might say the cultural turn points to consumerist understandings of everything and the penetration of image culture and the commodity in all of social life, which is a little gloss on what I just said. Shopping is the glue that keeps us going, but making meaning is an ongoing process and supplants the logic of the object. As a child of the 60s, I'd say, despite the repressive and isolating doctrines of high modernism, the concerns of citizenship, for want of a better word, reasserted themselves. Suddenly, the art world became visible in relation to other social institutions and systems, which helped enlarge the arena of action. Countercultural values and social activism pierced Cold War quiescence and acquiescence, giving rise to new social movements. I saw and continue to see artists seeking greater autonomy from art world gatekeepers, controlling monetary and cultural value alike. I have to, of course, point out that women artists were engaging in hermeneutical reading of precisely those modernist objects that claim to be creating a universal that is transnational, that is non-national, that is displaced reading of modernist objects, contesting their reception as wholly genderless while insisting on the deformalization of artistic production. That was and remains the place for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. That was great and inspiring. And there's an issue that runs through, I think, what everyone said that I want to draw out, especially with regard to Andrea Geyer bringing up Hannah Arendt this morning, because as I remember her definite, and also Joao doing so a moment ago, as I remember, if I'm remembering correctly, her model of revolution is a new space of appearance. And in some ways, I think all of you, somewhat surprisingly, but also inspiringly, are talking about art as a kind of new space of appearance in some way. And here I might risk being somewhat juridical, so pardon me, but I wonder if sometimes politics really is the wrong word for this particular kind of new space. And what I've been hearing through your work, what you say today, and the work of all of you that I know, and what people like Tom Hollert are also thinking about, are these questions really of ethics as opposed to politics. And to give, again, a way to schematic definition, and I think this has an Arendt genealogy possibly too, that politics require a demand of some sort. They are a kind of demand. Ethics, on the other hand, I would define as a responsibility to the other. And with regard to the question of art, that obviously has something to do with witnessing on some level, or creating a community or a sense of the common, maybe not always the commons as we know it through various theories of media and the internet, but a sense of a shared platform, a shared space of appearance. Because I do worry sometimes that in making claims for a certain kind of political art, art undermines what it can do by making claims for things that it can't do. And so I wonder if a switch in how I feel like all of you are using a slightly different vocabulary from how sometimes politics is used. So I don't know if anyone wants to respond to this, the kind of what is the efficacy of a new space of appearance specifically, and is this really an ethical question? And does that change anything about our discussions?
Can I just point out that it's not artists who attach the word political to their work ever? It seems bizarre. So it entered this debate, and it was in the question, and it's framing the debate, but I don't recognize myself in that term. That's all.
And then I would add to that ethics then become that as something related to the making of art becomes too huge a responsibility and an unfair demand on artists. I think the role of an artist is the work of what I can speak for myself. The engagement is much more about a process of realizing and understanding who you are, and understanding the world and context around you, and somehow whether it's reflective of building something else or going, like Cabana said, going back to the future and mining and working intensely hard to find a different reality or to find this impossible. There's not that's just a very big demand to then put on that practice, or on what else the image or an object or an experience can be that can have some other possibility.
I would just like to make very specific comments and sort of address specific points. One, I think that Occupy was established that one does not have to be demanding or have a specific demand, or rather can be infinitely demanding, as it was already evoked. Secondly, I think the spatialization of this idea is problematic, mostly because the argument usually reverts to an idea of leaving art behind, so forgetting the art world after art. This sort of, the options are disavowal, so leaving art behind altogether into another supposed space, leaving the art world as such, or then fully mapping your political intentions onto it, which is a strange spatialization. And you get into situations like the 7th Berlin Biennial, which was problematic in that respect. I also want to point out that this question of responsibility, it's interesting to me that we would preserve, I think, to a certain extent, rightly preserve this space for artists to not be responsible. And yet, simultaneously, there are certain dynamics that some people call this the kind of problem of urgency, in which artists are precisely the first people to be asked to do things when something goes wrong. So we simultaneously say that you don't have to be responsible, but then we expect artists to be, in a sense, the front guard of solving social problems. We sort of put artists to work. And I think that creates a kind of interesting, again, this problem of urgency. I also think we need to think about, maybe I would suggest, less this kind of specialized distinction and more talking about political effects and aesthetic affects and how they might be related. And if we talk very tangibly or very materially, which is perhaps not a popular way to discuss things anymore, but if we do speak materially, we can then understand that the problem actually lies in entirely new kinds of space. And those new kinds of spaces are spaces in which we are in the process of beginning to understand and then simultaneously relate a kind of ethical or political inflection. So I want to give you an example of where those become muddied. They're actually becoming muddied in our genetic material. So if you think about the average, and I'm almost done, if you think about the average storage capacity of regular today's media, that's DNA is about 1,000 times greater. So what you can do is you can put 100 million hours of video in 1 cup of DNA. In fact, we've already done this. So the two things that were encoded in January 2013 were all of Shakespeare's sonnets and an MP3 of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, encoded into human DNA, which means it could survive in the human body for 10,000 years, and it literally links the memory of the species with this kind of other cultural memory. And I think that's a political space, as much as an ethical one.
How does it intersect with art?
Because what we become talking about, is it productive to talk about art as a category itself? We can talk about aesthetic affects. Again, political effects, aesthetic affects, or aesthetic effects. And I think once you start encoding images into human DNA, that's a conversation we may be interested in. As cultural practitioners, as artists, as curators, I think that there's, the way the images work, the way the cultural practices
Isn't that
work,
an exit from the art world that you were just condemning?
I don't think so at all. I think what we have to become responsible for is how we relate to such things. And the great example, I'll give you a tangible example, Thomas Hirschhorn's Touching Reality, which is a piece in which Hirschhorn is scrolling, there's a hand scrolling through an iPad of all the images from Afghanistan and Iraq that we do not regularly get to see. So he's literally touching the very images that we are not allowed to see. I think that's a very precise indication of where we are politically and ethically.
But that's also limiting and has a very specific limit and demand. And you said something about where artists, that we put artists to work. Well, artists put themselves to work, and artists have this role that somehow operates in a way as it, and if the impossible can be something. That's something that's invented out of something else. And so I think that conversation, that has to be really, it just has to be very clear.
Yeah, if I might clarify, I agree with you, in fact. And I just think it's interesting that there is a natural reaction to putting artists to solve social problems. So I think that, so how do we reconcile the fact that we want to sort of be irresponsible, which I think is a great underestimated quality, at the same time not establishing criteria for why, as forces of gentrification and so forth, why does the artist have to be that vanguard? There seems to be an interesting demand of the people who are supposed to be without demand in that sense. So I agree, I just think there is a mechanism which calls upon artists to perform this kind of labor. I think it's sort of like, they do this in municipalities, they do this with Sandy. I mean, there's a mechanism there in which artists are compelled by whatever forces to do so. So I guess I'll frame it as a question. What is the inverse or the obverse of feeling of that? How would you describe that feeling, the feeling of being compelled to? As an artist, specifically, being compelled to intervene.
Well, my point is that I think that there are artists that feel that, and there are artists that retreat and are able through that retreat to participate and to contribute. And it's in that retreat and in the creation of something else that's what I'm talking about.
Right. Simon, did you want to weigh in on this?
Well, I mean, Santa Hannah of the Scuola Nuova, as we think of her. I'm not an Arendtian, and what Joao said is interesting. It's kind of chapter and verse where, in my department, and it's the limitations of the Arendtian model actually interest me more than what it's. I think it's particularly the stuff on revolution is terribly overblown. It's a very, very flawed book, deeply, deeply flawed book, and the whole distinction between the political and the social is hugely misconceived, and I could go on. So Arendt there's great things about Arendt, but I find the idea of politics as a space of appearance is a problem for someone like me. What you're saying about ethics and politics in Dave, I think that's right. I mean, but I don't see that as so much as a problem is that so politics requires demands. Yeah, and what Joao says is, in a sense, that whatever Occupy was about, transforming that language. The requirement that was placed on Occupy was, who are your leaders and what do you want? Right? What are the demands? And there was a refusal to occupy that space of demands, which can be seen as another kind of articulation. No demands or an infinite demand, and I see that as I've never seen a clear, hard and fast distinction between the ethical and the political, right? So for me, politics isn't some separate sphere, distinct sphere. Politics is that activity of, for me, I'm an old-fashioned Gramscian. So for me, politics is the activity of the formation of association, formation of a common front, which is motivated by deep ethical commitment. And I think, I don't want to tell artists what to do, and I don't, but in terms of citizens and in terms of, teachers, I think it's a question of infinite responsibility, I think, is absolutely crucial. And making a distinction between, I think much of the work that has interested me over the years is in artwork is deeply immoral and deeply ethical, right? Deeply immoral and ethical because it's immoral. So in a sense that what art is doing, one of the things it's doing is to disturb a kind of moral complacency. And that moral complacency, someone like the New School, can be a moral complacency about activism and civic engagement, which then becomes a kind of discourse that we mouth at the school and at the students as if we know what these things mean. And that makes me want to go back to Adorno and retreat into a kind of idea of, when Adorno says in, I think it's in the engagement essay, the commitment essay, or it's certainly in that period, that politics has migrated into aesthetic autonomy, and politics perhaps most apparent in those works that are politically dead. And he's thinking specifically of say Beckett as opposed to Sartre. So as it were, the question of political content, that if you fill your work with political content, it doesn't make it political, it makes it ideological. And why someone like Beckett might be political is because it's not. There's no political content there. So Adorno famously sees Endgame as a reflection on Holocaust, because it doesn't deal with it directly. It's in its indirection, right? That's its discipline. I think there's something to be learned about that. And this is a disconnected series of thoughts, but here's a story. And I'd like to know what you make of it. And it goes something like this. A friend of mine, Colin Robinson, did a little book instantaneous book of interviews that came out after Occupy Wall Street. It came out about a month after the police broke it up. And it begins with a schema of Zuccotti Park, an overview. a plan, like a floor plan. I looked at it, opened the book, looked at it, and thought, fuck, this is like a Thomas Herschel installation, right? It's a Thomas Herschel installation. It's like the 24-hour Foucault, or it's like the Bataille Monument. There's a media space, there's a library, there's a kitchen, there's all the other bits. So isn't that odd? Why would Zuccotti Park look like an installation? Now, that then raises the question, well, what do you do with that? And I'd say, there's a kind of porosity between art and politics. Porosity, but not an identity. And that porosity has taken quite an interesting form recently. So, anyway, I put that thought to Thomas Herschel last summer, because there's this show he's doing, this event he's doing up in the Bronx, the Gramsci Monument. And he said, yes, it does look a bit like Zuccotti Park, but what I'm doing is art, for formal reasons. And then he went back to drawing circles on a piece of paper with words in. And there's a problem. Right? There's an issue. So here's someone who's, in the series of monuments he's created, developed a form, right? Whatever one thinks of it, it's a form, and that form finds a kind of echo in a political situation. Right? I don't think that means that Occupy Wall Street was an art installation, and I don't think art installations are political. I don't think, I don't think that reading 20 pages of Jacques Rancière and going into a gallery in Berlin is a political act. Right? I think there's a confusion about that amongst many people. But there are strange analogies, at the formal level. And that's a sort of question to everybody here, I guess. That there's a porosity, it seems, between art and politics, and that's an odd point that we're at. And I'd like to.
Is it a strange analogy, or is it a shared form that comes into being in different contexts? I mean, that would get away from this dichotomy, for instance.
It's a shared form. A form has emerged, like I was saying about art not as a record of past events, but the possibility of forms and future forms. Here's a form, right? The form of a monument, or something like that. Martha looks like she's going to explode into flames. Maybe you should. I'm going to shut up.
I am speechless. I wonder if a conversation like this could take place in any place that mattered, in which we can say, oh, look, somebody set up. I know, I'm being insulting, that's why. Okay, son. Human beings presented, I'll just stick to small things. Human beings presented with a space which they have taken. Say, let's have this here and this here, the police are over there, the lights are over here, the access is here, the egress is there, let's do this. And then some artist also recognizes in some way by a plot, or some artist produces a plot that in some way reminds you of the way that human beings apportion space, and you see that this is some kind of relationship. The relationship is one you have constructed. It's like something back in the 30s where artists were bemused by the fact that, oh, look, we're drawing circles, but nature loves circles. Wow, there must be some reason. It's the interpenetration of natural form into what artists do. Yeah, maybe, but is this in any way useful? Is it something that we can learn? Or what I hear is a validation of the production of an artist for whom spatiality is a major element. So why wouldn't spatiality, as humans recognize it, be visible in his work and somehow recognizable in other forms? I'm sure if you weren't thinking about Occupy, there would be many other forms that you would say, Thomas Hirschhorn's Gramsci Monument looks just like this. In other words, I'm saying that for me, excuse me, shoot me now, this is what people do, and this is how we learn. It's the productive collision of ideas that may, in fact, have nothing to do with one another, but I don't find it particularly productive, and I think it's really odd that you take this wisp of of a formal relationship and somehow see this as a telling allegorical moment in which we can say something either about the art or the encampment. They just seem like nice, but not actually based. I mean,
I'll propose it. There's almost no one sitting in the center, so I'll take up that position. I think the word we're looking for is homology, and so the fact that both practices may have emerged from some common form of negotiation of space. I want to make two suggestions. One is my evocation of Arendt is merely to say that already at the source text, or a central source text of aesthetic conceptions in the Western tradition, there is already a slightly Talmudic rereading of apolitics, which I think destabilizes the sort of source origin of aesthetic categories. The second follow-up, so it's not to say that Arendt's model is the one we should follow, but it's to say, look, already in the central text that substantiates that separation, disinterestedness, taste, sociology, and all that, there already is a political project. And in fact, Arendt's point is, why did Kant not write a book on politics? He didn't need to, because he already did, and it's called The Third Critique. Mm-hmm. The follow-up to that is, I do think, and here's where I wanted to sort of be generous to others, is that I think that there's an interesting upsurge of people like C.N. Ngai's book, Our Aesthetic Categories, to try to move beyond these distinctions. And the distinction has to do with always relying on very constrained aesthetic categories to judge things aesthetically or not. So instead of talking about beauty or colonics or sublimity, we can talk about cuteness as the way that we relate to certain commodities. We can talk about the interesting as a kind of viral way in which information or practices circulate. That's interesting, is to evoke in someone else a kind of desire. Or wackiness as a kind of production of a kind of labor, our need to constantly be wacky, interesting, or cute as somehow a version of commodification. So if we expand those categories, those aesthetic modalities beyond beauty, sublimity, form, decoration, whatever that might be, we may open up an interesting arena of conversation. And I think that's what Arendt was trying to suggest in that.
Should we open up to the...
Yeah, but first, can I just take another hit at this?
Yeah, one more hit, and then we're going to open to the audience.
Certain things that people do have instrumental value. You set up places that work based on the confines of a space that that you've been allocated or you've seized. This is an instrumental use of space. It answers to certain human feelings about privacy, noise, segregation, use, and so on. The fact that an artist produces something in space that draws upon or quotes the whole concept of the way humans set up, the tents in the desert is not a comment about that artist or that artist's relationship to anything other than perhaps the common tendencies of humans everywhere to situate things in ways that are legible to people who are actually going to walk through and inhabit the space. On the one hand, we have something that is largely instrumental and answers to whatever desires people have for a nice place, and on the other, we have something that is, one assumes, wholly symbolic. So to hear them somehow mapped onto one another, I find less than useful. So
that I think that it's precisely in the midst of that contradiction that is like of what's most interesting to any artist that I know, that it's about really the investigation inside that contradiction, being a painter and working in a world of crisis. Is that a futile project? And with the understanding of the inability of pictures, the fact that paintings and pictures and objects can actually there's a certain failure in them, but there's this other deeper kind of belief or desire and commitment in there. It's within that contradiction, and it's within the contradiction that's coming up that is, to me, one of the most interesting types of different spaces and allows for a new type of possibility as well.
Okay, let's see if there are audience questions. Looks like in the middle. Are there people with microphones?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Is this thing on? I don't think it's on. Is it on? Okay. I relate to Martha's frustration with the form of the questions, and that it seems impossible to answer them without accepting that there's a certain kind of distance between art and politics, and that which art either crosses over or does not, and sometimes is engaged and sometimes not. But it seems like that after you made the statement, Martha, that you actually can't imagine artistic gestures which are not political, and there not being a political valence of any art. It seems like that the inverse is that also there is always a form to politics, however conceived or figured, and so would it be that a more useful discussion here would be to talk about how the forms of art and the forms of politics are linked and laminated and entangled with each other, and how interesting or radical or new or progressive art can relate to interesting or radical or new or beautiful or cute politics, and perhaps also what the risks are of art which is aesthetically interesting, but politically either banal or ugly.
Is that a question or a statement?
Wouldn't it be nicer if that was what we were talking about?
What?
The question is, wouldn't it be nicer if that was the question?
I was saying, was that a question, Alan, or a statement? I think it was a statement, no?
Well, the question is, wouldn't it be nicer if that was how we framed the discussion? But maybe it was a statement.
No. Speaking personally, I'm both energized and also annoyed by an effort to discuss these things. I would just as soon be in the audience and going, that's interesting, or maybe that's interesting. But when I'm put on the spot and asked to make distinctions among things that I think actually are slightly beside the point, I get a little shook up, especially when there are distinctions not just between formal, aesthetic, symbolic, whatever, things and actions, but in which one tries to separate perhaps ethics from politics, which, is a huge political fight that's been going on forever, but is generally an analytic distinction that's not so useful when you're actually trying to engage in a political movement, for example. I'll take that back slightly. because in fact it is actually central to political questions, but it's not necessarily central to political questions in relationship to symbolic activity.
I think there'll be other questions. Who's got it now? Who's got the?
Should I just shout?
Yeah, just.
Okay. I was just wondering, having been.
Can you stand up because we can't hear you?
Speak into
Okay. Having been here throughout the entire morning and sort of listening to issues that try to kind of map the way that artistic practice or art or cultural production relates to forms of activism, of political action, I'm kind of stunned to sort of see that the issues that do not come up are perhaps most representative of kind of the current state of art and politics. And what I feel is most occluded in these conversations, whether it's identity politics or art and activism, are questions of economic access, of neoliberal formation, which is very much tied to the way that capital operates in today's society, the way actually capital structures what we mean by contemporary art, and the way that contemporary art is political. Because in a way, this very discourse about art, contemporary art being political, like a wrong sort of the Chantal Mouffe and Jacques Rancière alliance, is very much predicated on a neoliberal logic to occlude the very thing that produces the inequalities and the violence which we're trying to ameliorate with contemporary art practice. And actually maybe it is the discomfort of the fact how there's this kind of pact, or not pact, not to sound conspiratorial, between contemporary artistic practice and its involvement in structural violence, that is the conversation we can't have because it's so uncomfortable, because we're all kind of involved in it. And I would be interested to hear, I don't know, from anyone, what their thoughts on that are.
I mean, contemporary art is a kind of excrescence of the system that you're describing very well. So I agree with you. And it's an easy thing to hate, and it should be hated for the most part. And we could talk about that. And we could talk about the whole infrastructure that makes that possible, and the way in which, you know, much, if not most, contemporary art is a symptom of a rampant capitalization of the mind. So I agree with you. Then the question is, well, where is the space for critique in relationship to that? We have the modernist answer in terms of an idea of aesthetic autonomy. And there was, you know, and then the question that then raises is such a form of autonomy as a space of critique possible in present socioeconomic conditions? And I think it's certainly more difficult. Some people have talked about semi-autonomy, that works of art can... Sorry? You think that's bullshit as well, I suppose? Yeah, okay. Forget it. It's not worth doing it. Yeah.
Okay, who's...
I feel like I should apologize to you for my utter failure, because I feel like I addressed specifically those questions. Sorry. I feel compelled to apologize to you for what I feel is my utter failure, because I feel like I did sort of directly address those issues. So if we can find a space in which perhaps my language and your language, we may be talking about similar things, but we use different words, we may be able to recognize that that was addressed, particularly in my comments about resistance to and compliance with hegemony, my attempt to point out specific things about cognitarian labor, to use precisely those kinds of buzzwords. But I feel that, in a sense, I failed at making that as explicit as I ought to. So a unrhetorical apology for a rhetorical circumlocution.
Well, I mean, everyone on the panel really talked about these sort of reserved spaces. I was very surprised. I mean, about, you know, kind of affect as a separate sphere in an unproblematic way. So,
I don't know that I talked about affect as separate. I explicitly said that there are new kinds of affects produced by capital, and that some of those affects are aesthetic, and they're produced by a mechanism that is political. So what would be the implication of that?
Okay, next question.
So I think I can try to give an example or some specific content to the preceding question, and at the risk of restating this modernist interventionist opposition, which I don't totally subscribe to, but Julie Mehretu sort of talked about two kinds of artists who retreat and participate in other ways, and artists who intervene. But I just wanted to ask Julie or anyone on the panel, I think following this question, a piece of yours that's very near Zuccotti Park is the extremely large mural hanging in the lobby of Goldman Sachs. And you talked about painting as a defiant gesture and also as an action of dissent. And do you see that work as either defiant or an action of dissent, or do the other panelists want to weigh in on that question too?
I see the act of painting and the way that I approach digesting and participating in the world and then making work as an act of dissent. I see the mark in the painting as operating that way. And that painting specifically, I feel, operates in a much more complicated way, and that's the reason that I was interested in it. The site is completely complicated. I'm interested in that discomfort. I'm interested in going straight into that, and the type of possibility of an audience that a painting can have, and a painting usually has. And most painting is a very privileged audience that mimics in many ways the way the audience looks in here. They're the audience that goes to museums or galleries and confronts paintings and interacts with paintings. But yeah, stretched painting on, the way that painting has traditionally operated, it's not something that you confront in the street or that you confront in a building on the back of a blast wall in the center of like the epitome of a neoliberal capitalist kind of system. And so all of these are interests in my work and interests of the work that I'm doing. And so for me, it was a super ripe location for that. I don't see that painting as actually being an agent of activism by itself. That's not how I necessarily. I see works of art as existing on and having the freedom to exist on a different plane, and that I don't necessarily think that intervention is absolutely necessary of those works of art, but I think that sometimes what can be given is even greater than what could happen through intervention.
This was my slightly glib, but now that I firmly stand behind, invocation of Charlie Chaplin, because Chaplin is the figure who, when you put him in the assembly line, cannot reproduce the gestures of that model of capitalism. And so if we are infinitely reproducing the gestures of one particular model of capitalism by sort of flicking, touching, and swiping, then what would be the equivalent of those gestures as a kind of resistance to the somatic codification of labor, which is the other part I talked about and I think relates to your specific question. So what's the sort of Chaplin-esque version of that? Ultimate performativity, that ultimate sort of creative anarchic energy, same energy as La Lue, La Liberté, that fantastic René Clair film. That kind of, what is the equivalent of that kind of productive creative energy? I think it's an interesting heuristic.
I think we probably only have time for one more question, so I don't know who's got. Jonathan in the middle over there, can we get a microphone?
I have a microphone.
Okay, and then we'll have two more questions. I'll make a...
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Where are you?
I wanted to, there was one question that derives from these ideas of this moment, this panel, this whole day has this amazing painting of coming from French Revolution, and it's kind of interesting that when we understand of a revolution, we think of it only as a success, like something happened or something was accomplished, but no one really talks about that it was a failure for many others. I don't know if this failure or success comes from the ones that are oppressed or the ones that oppress. For the ones that oppress, it could be a failure to maintain the ways that they were basically, to maintain their establishment, to maintain the way of thinking, to maintain social constructions the way they were, or the way they is. So I'm just wondering that there were some artists in the Versailles. They were paid artists from the monarchies to paint, to do art. And there were some artists that they were outside the Versailles, and they were doing art, and they were doing other things, and they were participating. And, the thing is, in my opinion, that I feel that there is a lot of discussion about the in or the out, but not about what that brought, what that distinction brought, what this kind of enlightenment brought. This idea of like there were some in and some were out, or some were like fighting and some were not fighting. And I think that brought basically these inequalities that we are based on, the inequalities of the decisions we make creating these spaces of articulation. And I think, perhaps for some here in this room, French Revolution is like a significant moment in history. For some, maybe it's not, because maybe French Revolution brought something that we were not able yet to articulate what we're going to do with it,
Does anyone want to respond to that?
I've never been an enthusiast of the French Revolution. I think it's a greatly overrated event. First, it was a bourgeois revolution, as Marx said, and secondly, it was a belated revolution because, if you want to understand the emergence of the modern world, you begin in the Netherlands and you begin in the English 17th century. The French had an unfortunately delayed reaction to what was happening elsewhere. And we see the French Revolution through a kind of French lens, which I think is greatly unfortunate. And I've always been very sympathetic to Burke's critique of the French Revolution. So sorry to say in this company that you eliminate the institutions of society, you create a power vacuum into which steps the figure of the dictator. And that overlooks an essential element in political thinking, which is that politics as a form of association has to bring with it the existence of what Rousseau called les mœurs, mores, habits, practices. And they have to be brought through if you want lasting change. This is the problem with the whole category of revolution for me, but I come from a different political tradition.
So Karen, can we do one more? Okay, one more question, Jonathan.
It's not going to be a question about whether the French Revolution was good or not. What I noticed, I think, and I think this might be a good point to end at, is there was a certain kind of, I don't know if it's say agreement, but David and Martha, towards the end, that something interesting happened to me that I at least recognized. And I guess it's analogous to a lot of things that happen in queer art now, or how queer is being used, that when I do crits at RISD and things like that, and I've become increasingly annoyed by the use of queerness, so that anything is queer. So, if you take a big white box and you put it in a big room, a student will say, well, I'm queering the space. And I felt that there, at the basis of David's original question, there is this certain kind of sense that we might have reached the point where the political is, can be anything, and isn't there some kind of distinctions? And I understood Martha's resistance to that, because it does sound like the old kinds of arguments coming up. But then towards the end, when you got very annoyed, as I did, when there was this sort of analogy being made between actual incredible political moment, when they were doing Occupy Wall Street, and then this sort of, kind of art formy kind of, I have to say, this kind of reading of, and yes, everything is the political, but sometimes, just like anything else, that you feel it, and there is something worth a distinction, just as, there's a difference between certain, I know it's very hard to categorize these things, and probably not useful to categorize them on some level, but on another level, it is very necessary to sort of say, well, this is a work of art where the person is sticking their neck out, or might be killed, or might be put in prison because they made this kind of art. And then there's another kind of art that, even though the artist says is political, is small. It gets put up in basically in a lobby, right? Or it could be, can be in Foxwoods, and the corporations don't seem to care about it. There are different kinds of, and then also contexts in which, at one context, making a certain kind of art making an abstract painting might get you in jail, or in another context, that's perfectly fine.
Do you think making art has to get you in jail, or you have to risk your life?
I don't think that, but I think there is something about I don't see why it's necessary to say that the art that you're making is necessarily political. Or let's put it this way, if it is political, if you think that you're making something that's resistant.
Nobody's saying that.
Just let me finish. I don't think it's useful. Then you failed on that level. Let's put it that way. And I'm not saying I love your paintings, but I'm not saying why is it
but I'm saying
necessary
nobody's
to
saying that they're
justify
making political art.
Right.
Nobody's saying that. Nobody's. I
But
think
you called
even
it an
Martha
act
said.
of
Even Martha.
resistance.
No, I said myself going into the studio and making a mark on a piece of paper instead of participating in something else, which is generally a consumptive act.
Right.
That to me, in sitting down and consistently insisting on having some sense of individuality and that's meaningful, that's an act of resistance. And I'll stand by that. Whether or not, I mean, whatever, if it's consumed or not consumed, looked at or not looked at. But what Martha said is artists never said this, that by trying to make political art. Artists make art. And some artists, they have a different desire.
Let me say something, because we should get angry about that. That's just, I was surprised that you said that, Martha. I love your work. But there have been artists who said, I want to make political art. Whether it's Stuart Davis, whether there are, artists in the 30s who said, I am making political art. Even David Hockney said, I'm making propaganda for gay rights. And ACT UP artists certainly said that they were making political art. So that's just not true that artists don't sometimes say that they want to make political art. I just don't even understand what that means.
I still say that the category of political art is hung on art as a form of commodification. It's one thing for somebody to claim that they have someone saying, no, but they're political intentions or whatever, but when the term political art becomes a visible term, at least since I've been alive, I wasn't alive then, even though you may not believe it, but it's always been a frightening moment for those who are actually engaged in art that sees itself as taking place somewhere in the discussions legible to many people in the world that have to do with the rights, responsibilities of governance and citizenship, and questions of identity, etc. All the things that you would call political. So.
Okay, I mean, I guess the mark of a good conversation, is that you still want to talk more. So thanks to all the panelists for your participation.
Thank you. Come back in 10 minutes.